Hello, I am Rob from the Tequila Collective, and today I am joined by Dr. Kristen Lear of Bat Conservation International. October is Bat Awareness Month, and bats are very important to agave and tequila. So I'm very excited to have Dr. Kristen Lear here. Thank you for joining us, Kristen.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's talk about bats. And if you don't mind sharing, what exactly is Bat Conservation International?
Yeah, so Bat Conservation International, or BCI, we are a nonprofit. We work around the world to end bat extinctions. So we're working in over 21 countries now to lead conservation and research efforts that protect threatened and endangered bat species, protect them from extinction.
Amazing. How many bat species are there throughout the world?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's currently over, 1,500 species. That is
Wow.
a new number. Just the past month, there has been a new discovery of a bat species. So we're constantly learning more. We're constantly, gaining numbers.
Yeah, that's a lot of different types of bats. I think
It
when
is.
people think about bats, I think they think of this time of year, Halloween, and the spooky nature of bats, and they have just that almost
Yep.
cartoon image and vampire type of idea. But it's really fascinating that there's so
Mm.
many different types of bats, and they all, I'm assuming, serve different purposes. In for what we're going to be talking about, they obviously are pollinators of agave, but aside from that, just on a broader scale, what is the importance of bats in our environment and the different ecosystems around the world, and what kind of role do they play?
Yeah, bats are so with 1,500 species. I mean, there's every type of bat you can imagine. There's like brown bats, there's white bats, there's spotted bats. I mean, there's all this variety of looks, and there's all this diversity of what they eat and the kind of the role they play in ecosystems. So about 70% of bats worldwide eat insects, things
Mhm.
like beetles and moths and mosquitoes. And a lot of those insects are pest insects for our agricultural crops. So things like pecans or corn or cotton that are predated by these little moths or beetles. And the bats are eating those pests and helping protect those crops. And so that pest control service of those bats saves billions of dollars to the US and the worldwide agricultural industry from their pest control services.
Wow.
So, they really are this keystone species of keeping those insect populations under control. So that's about the majority of the bats, about 70%. There's
Okay.
other species that eat nectar, so I know
Mhm.
we'll dive more into that. But
Right.
they eat nectar from flowers, just like hummingbirds or bees, and in the process, they pollinate those plants. And so there are hundreds of plants worldwide that are pollinated either exclusively or in part by bats. And we'll dive more into all that later, but they're very important for a lot of these agricultural crops that we use.
Right.
And then other bat species eat fruit. They're fruit bats, and they help disperse seeds. So they're eating the seeds and they're spitting out or pooping out the seeds, and they help regrow places like tropical rainforests that are being the trees are being cut down. The bats are
Wow.
helping regrow those trees. So
Wow.
very
Amazing.
important for lots of things.
Yeah, that's amazing. And
Yeah.
I feel like just on the topic of food, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I know there are bats that do drink blood.
Oh, yes, there are. So
How
over
many different species? Because I have a feeling, that's what bats are known for. They turn into
yes,
vampires, all the classic, kind of cartoon type of
yep,
ideas behind bats. But it is true that there are certain species.
yes.
But of the 1,500 or so, how many actually drink blood?
I'm glad you asked that. Three. So
Wow, that's
three
it.
out of 1,500 species eat blood. So it's not oh gosh, the blood-sucking vampires. There
Right.
are those three species of vampire bats, but they're only found in Mexico and Central and South America. They're not global, they're not worldwide.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, they're really actually they're very important and really neat animals because
Mhm.
we've developed several medicines and therapies for us based on these vampire bats. So they have this anticoagulant in their saliva that helps keep the blood flowing the
They
chicken or the cow that they're eating from.
they call
And
that
yeah,
Draculin, right?
they call it Draculin. So we've
Wow.
created a medicine to help create that anticoagulation and help stroke victims. So yeah, they're very important, even if they seem kind of that creepy
Yeah.
aspect.
Well, aside from the blood-sucking bats, I want to talk specifically about the species that are relevant to agave plants. And
Hmm.
I think my first question is, and we'll dive into the importance of bats and as pollinators and how they
Hmm.
affect agave and the different types of agave and the regions where those agave grow. Um, but how many species are in that region of Mexico up through the southern
Yeah.
United States? How many different species of bats are there that populate those regions and that are feeding off of the agave as pollinators and using their nectar
Hmm.
as food?
Yeah, so there's three main species of pollinating bat that are actual nectar feeders that are migrating annually between central and southern Mexico all the way to northern Mexico and the southwest US. So those three species are adapted to eat nectar from agave plants and other plants as well. There are some insect-eating bats, like the pallid bat you might have heard about in the southwest and in Mexico, that
Mhm.
will actually land on agave flowers and on cactus flowers and eat nectar. They're not adapted to do that, but sometimes they supplement their insect diet with nectar.
Yeah.
But yeah, the three nectar species are the ones that are the primary pollinators of agave.
So can you kind of explain how bats actually feed and, how these three different species are adapted to uh, eating the nectar and subsequently pollinating the agave? Can you explain
Yeah.
I guess, their anatomy or how they've developed and evolved to do that?
Yep. Yeah, so the cool thing about the three species is in their names, they're kind of explain how they do this. So the one species is the Mexican or greater long-nosed bat, which is an endangered species. There's the lesser long-nosed bat and the Mexican long-tongued bat.
Okay.
So you have all these long noses, long tongues, but that kind of explains how they're doing what they're doing. They
Right.
have long noses and these long tongues that can be several inches long that they lap deep into the flowers of agave plants or cactus plants. And that's how they reach deep inside those flowers with that really long tongue. And so that's kind of how they're doing that nectar feeding. And the really cool thing about these bats, these three species, and the long-nosed bats in particular, is that they're not the most graceful eaters. When we think of pollinators like hummingbirds or bees, they're hovering, right? They go up to the flower, they hover really, really gently, and they put their proboscis in, get the nectar, their tongue, and then they go away. These bats cannot really hover very well. They can't it's not very graceful. So what they do is they come up and they kind of land on the flowers and really quickly, but they land and then they lap the nectar and then go away and do that all over. And when they're doing that kind of attacking of the flower, they get covered in pollen. And that's how they spread all this pollen to plant is from the pollen on their fur.
Got it. So
Hmm.
on average, how much is a bat landing on an agave plant, the quiote, which would be the
Hmm.
portion that grows out of the agave and has the flowers?
Hmm.
How much are they feeding in? I'm assuming at night. How
Yeah.
often is that happening?
Yeah.
Um, how frequently are they eating? Is it multiple times a night, or is
Yeah.
it every few days? How often does that happen?
Yeah, great question. So these nectar bats have really high metabolisms and nectar is basically pure sugar. They
Hmm.
get some protein from the pollen as well, but it's this really high sugar, intake. And if you've ever, taken a lot of sugar, you know that it's pretty high, quick, and then you crash, right?
Sure.
So these bats have to eat frequently, every several hours or so, throughout each night to get that energy. And so, yeah, they'll come out from their roost, sunset as it's getting dark. They'll go feed on agave flowers or cactus flowers, and they can visit, couple hundred times during a bout as they're flying around. And then they go back to their cave or a night roost where they clean themselves. They socialize. They're very social and they're very clean animals. They do spend a lot of time grooming and socializing. And then they'll go back out again at like 10, midnight. And then throughout the night, they'll do those little feeding bouts. And then one last hurrah, before kind of like their dinner, right before sunrise, they'll go out and get filled up so that they can go through the day without eating and then do it all
Wow.
over again.
Wow. So of the three species that are the primary pollinators of agave, um, are all three migratory, or does a couple of
Mhm.
those species do they just live in the same place? I see you shaking your or nodding your
Yes,
head
they're
yes.
migratory.
So
Yeah, so
what is their route like?
so there's kind of two main routes. So the really crazy and cool thing is that it's mostly the pregnant females that undergo this long distance migration northward while they're pregnant. The males tend to stay put in southern and central Mexico and they hang out in little bachelor colonies. The females migrate and then they come back with their babies in the fall. So
Wow.
that's kind of crazy to begin with. But they take kind of two routes. So through Mexico, they take the Sierras, the Sierra Madre Oriental and Occidental, so to the east and to the west. They're following these mountain chains north, and then they get into Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, very southern, in western portions, and
Mhm.
then they migrate back south in the fall.
What is that journey like? How many weeks or months does that
Hmm.
take? What time of year is that?
Yeah. So it's spring. So kind of just like the monarchs, the same thing.
Sure.
It's the pregnant females leave central Mexico in, southern Mexico in the spring while they're pregnant. Then it takes them, a month or so, month or two. In June, July, they get up to the northern part of Mexico. And then in July, August, September, October, they're in that far north range and the US where they kind of hang out and they refuel on agave nectar, people's hummingbird feeders. People get bats at their hummingbird feeders. They're restocking in that fall period before they start migrating back south. Usually by October is when they'll leave the US and start
Got it.
going back south.
So through that entire pattern, that route that they're taking up through Mexico into the southern United States, are they feeding primarily on agave the whole way
Mm-hmm.
up, or are they having to find other food sources?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. So there's over 40 plants, different plant species that they feed on when they're in the southern and more portion of their range. So they
Hmm.
have a lot of diversity of food down there.
Okay.
As they migrate further north, it becomes less and less diverse of food sources. And when they reach, particularly the endangered Mexican long-nosed bat, when they reach that far northern edge of Mexico and the US, it is only agave plants, a few species
Wow.
that fuel them. There's no other blooming cacti that they can feed on that are adapted to bats. There's nothing else naturally for them.
Wow.
So yeah, agaves kind of as you go further north become more and more important.
So, what is an organization like Bat Conservation International or other organizations or just independent, private people or groups? What are they doing in order to, I guess, give the bats more opportunities to have a food source? Because I
Mm-hmm.
imagine, as you go up through northern Mexico and as you say that their food becomes their options become more limited.
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling without knowing any information that, the different types of agave spirits, although there's a lot of crops
Mm-hmm.
involved for that, they're not letting them flower. So that is less and less opportunity to eat. And
Mm-hmm.
then just with the way the world is and industrialization and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
I'd imagine there's not a lot of options available, maybe compared to,
Mm-hmm.
years past. So what's
Yes.
happening there? What's that like?
Yeah, that's so that loss of agave habitat and that fragmentation of agave patches along that migratory corridor is one of the primary threats to these species, particularly the Mexican long-nosed bat. And yeah, so restoring that migratory agave nectar corridor is a priority recovery action to recover the species. And so at BCI, at Bat Conservation International, we're working with a huge diversity of partners to replant agaves along that corridor. So, we're working with local ejido communities in Mexico, with local nonprofits across both countries, with ranchers, private landowners, to grow out native agaves in community and private nurseries, and then plant those agaves in these really key, migratory corridor areas and climate refugia that will be important in the future with climate change. And
Wow.
so we're planting agaves. We've planted, and when I say we, it's this diversity of partners. We have over 100 partners that we're working with, so it's an all hands on deck approach.
Mhm.
But through that, we've planted over 182,000 agaves so far, and
Wow.
have a couple 100,000 more in the pipeline. But it really goes beyond just purely planting agaves. We're working with communities and private landowners in both countries to restore the broader habitat. When you see these agave landscapes, naturally they will have a lot of good, healthy native vegetation. They'll have healthy grasses or healthy desert scrub. They'll have these plants that should be there in a healthy environment. And, with land use, with unsustainable grazing or farming conversion, there's a lot of those other plants being lost as well. And the soil and the water of those parcels of land is really degraded. So we work from the beginning. We work from, let's restore this piece of land. Let's restore the soil and the water, make sure there's good, healthy soil. Make
Mhm.
sure then we have those other native plants that help support healthy agave populations. And we add in and replant agaves. So it's this broader habitat restoration beyond just let's go plant some agaves.
Right.
We need to make sure that the conditions are there for survival.
Right.
And we do that with these communities, many private landowners and communities in both countries. And we're also working to support sustainable practices. So, in regards to liquor production, there are communities and producers who are making agave liquor like mezcal or tequila or bacanora. And we work with them to implement practices that help support wild agave populations. So in some cases, these producers are collecting wild agave seeds from healthy wild spots, regrowing those agaves in nurseries, and then replanting those healthy agaves back out on the landscape to kind of offset their kind of cultivation of agaves.
Okay.
So that's one way they can support these bats is by replanting wild agaves.
I was
Um,
I was actually going to
mhm,
ask, that kind of leads me into my next question. Um,
mhm,
Tequila is you can only it's dependent on one variety of agave, and
yeah.
that one variety, the Blue Weber agave, has become essentially a monoculture.
Mhm,
The way it has been cultivated, and the majority of agave, if not all of it, is essentially grown from a clone of the mother plant, not from seed.
mhm,
Uh, that lack of diversity. And I know that the Blue Weber is
mhm.
not the main food source, and it's just one of a variety of agave, but
Yep.
is if that's happening in not only with the blue agave but other varieties, is that monoculture,
Mhm.
or the dependency on just cloning plants, is that harmful to the bats in some way?
Yeah, so that great question. So yeah, historically, thousands of years ago, when these bats and the agaves were co-evolving, they
Mhm.
had this tight relationship. And then, we started cultivating agaves, and as it became more and more monoculture, you lose that, like you said, that genetic diversity. And what they do in a lot of these farms is they castrate or cut the plant before it
Right.
starts flowering or as it starts to flower, because that encapsulates the sugars in the base of the plant, which then we harvest to make those products. And if you imagine when they prevent that stalk from growing, there's no food for bats.
Right.
And so you have these fields of thousands and thousands of agaves that look like they could be a mecca for bats and other pollinators, but not a single stalk is stalking, is blossoming.
Right.
So there's no food. And so you're creating these little kind of food deserts across that landscape where once there might have been wild agaves growing on that hillside, now you have this monoculture that none are flowering. And so that's why, working with producers and farmers and communities to replant wild agaves and or, letting some of their crop flower for bats. We work with some producers, some bacanora producers in Sonora to do that, to let some of those agaves flower. That's a great strategy.
Yeah.
And there's other organizations that are doing that. The Bat Friendly Tequila and Mezcal program is one of those programs that is working more in central and southern Mexico to make sure that producers, leave some to flower. So that's, there's different organizations trying to attack the problem from different angles.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's something I feel like I'm learning more and more about, and there's not a lot of information out there
Mm-hmm.
regarding, how this affects the bats. And I feel like there isn't a lot of
Yeah.
information just about bats in general. Um,
Yep.
but it would be, I think, wise of the industry to start making those efforts to,
Mm-hmm.
because it's obviously not just bats either, but bats are vital. We can't
Mm-hmm.
use bats just, from what
No.
you were saying earlier when we started speaking,
Mm-hmm.
just, the diversity that they bring to the different ecosystems that they're in around the world.
Yeah.
It's not just tequila or mezcal production that is dependent on
Right.
them.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. No, and I think one of the other things too for me is that agaves themselves, they're not just used for liquor,
right.
right? They're used by communities in Mexico and in the US for a variety of other reasons. People use agaves for livestock fodder for their cattle and their goats, particularly in times of drought when there's no good native grasses growing.
Mhm.
They use them, the stalks, to build houses and fences. The whole plants themselves are planted to help control erosion because they have great
Yeah.
root systems that hold the soil. I mean, there's just so many uses of agaves that if we lose agaves, we lose not just tequila, mezcal, and bacanora, but we lose all these other important cultural and economic uses.
Right.
So it's one of those kind of really tight relationships. These bats are some of the most effective pollinators. Because they are so messy when they eat, they actually collect a lot more pollen than many other animals like hummingbirds or insects. And these bats spread the pollen a lot farther than most other animals. These bats are flying 50, 60, 70 kilometers one way in a night, 30
Wow.
miles one way from their roost to go eat and spread pollen across all these agaves. So
Yeah.
they're extremely important for maintaining that healthy agave diversity.
How many bats are, I guess, in a colony? Would that be
Good
what do
question.
you
Yeah, a
call a
colony.
collective of bats?
Yep, a colony. Yep. So in a roost, like a cave or a mine, an old abandoned mine, it depends on the species. You can have thousands and thousands of these bats, or you can have one or a group of
Yeah.
10 or 50. So yeah, it kind of depends on the species, but it's a range.
Wow.
Yep.
That's fascinating. Do
Yeah.
do the agave pollinating bats, do they tend to have a preferred agave type? Or
Mm,
will they eat? I just
yeah.
keep thinking, there are certain types of agave that, especially as agriculture has progressed in technology, um,
Yep.
it used to be like 8 to 10 years was what a blue agave needed in order to be mature enough to make a really high
Hmm.
quality tequila. And now we can see agave growing in, 5 or 6 years to get
Yeah.
to that same level of maturity. I would think that, the agave types that would be most beneficial to be planting are those quicker maturing agave plants because there are
Yeah.
some that take, 25, 30 years to mature. So what
Yes.
do bats have a favorite, type of agave that they want to eat, or is it all just sugar
Yeah.
town? What's best for the conservation effort?
That's a great question. So they'll eat from kind of anything. They
Okay.
really like the paniculate agave, so the big agaves that have the branches out that look like trees. So
Hmm.
there's the spigot agaves that are just a column with tiny little flowers.
Hmm.
Those flowers are kind of too small and it's not good enough for them. But any of those big paniculate agaves, they'll eat from. So, agave, like ornamental species like agave americana or salmiana in some areas that may not be like native historically to the area, they'll eat from them.
Wow.
We work with native species as much as possible, but we recognize that people do like to plant ornamental agaves as well in their yards, and they will eat from them.
Wow.
So yeah, as long as they're flowering, they like them.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, any of those faster growing is great because then they get food faster, of course.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Wow. It's when you start to think about just like the different agave varieties, it's there's like so many
Hmm.
options for bats to choose from, but at the same time, they
Hmm.
are historically regional, these different types of agave, and then
Yep.
the industrialization of them, really
Hmm.
plays a factor in what's available. And I wonder,
Yeah.
um, with the industrialization and there's deforestation and there's uh, just the land is not used the same way and as you mentioned,
Hmm.
a lot of these agave plants they might look like this mecca for feeding and for bats, but none of them have grown a quiote and flowered, so there's no food in this sea of agave.
Yep.
Um, what what would the world, I guess, if you've ever thought about this or this has ever, been brought up, what would the world of agave and bats look like if there was no industrialization of
Mm.
these agave types of
Yeah.
spirits or just the other uses, or they were just on a more concentrated, smaller level of what I imagine was probably the world 100 years ago before
Hmm.
big alcohol,
Yeah.
big tequila, big mezcal, like all that kind of stuff like took off.
Yeah.
What was the world?
Yeah. I think there would be a mix of cultivation and wild harvest that's done sustainably. So, many of these agave species pup, so they produce clonal
Right.
offshoots underground as well as reproduce sexually from seed. Some
Mhm.
don't pup, so there's a lot of nuance there, but all that to say is that wild harvest can be done sustainably. Um, Cutting the quiote before it flowers actually can stimulate clonal pup production because it's like a last ditch effort to reproduce.
Mhm.
It knows it's not going to reproduce through seed, so let's put more pups out. And then you can harvest those pups carefully and replant them and create
Right.
new patches. So there's ways to do it sustainably. So I think that would be part of it. And then cultivating, right? Cultivating on a level where you're still allowing maybe some to flower. You collect those seeds, you grow those seeds in native, plant nurseries, and then replant those on the landscape or on your farm. You're then getting the benefit from getting your product, but you're also helping feed the bats and reaping the benefits of their pollination. So that's kind of the would be the ideal. And there are producers out there that are this eco-focused, trying to support wildlife that are trying to do this. It's just on a much smaller scale than the giant producers.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the challenge now is like how do we integrate with the different scales of production and the actors within those different scales? Because there's different approaches, right, for
Right.
each level.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of working with those different producers, the different, farmers and all the
Hmm.
people involved, what are some things that your organization looks for, or how do you
Mm,
partner with them specifically, aside from,
yeah.
obviously educating and then, wanting them to be part of this? What is something that, or what are the few things
Hmm.
that you guys are
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah, so we've historically focused on community-based restoration work. So working with local ejido communities in Mexico and in the US, but not for liquor production. But working with those communities to implement restoration practices that support agave habitat. And then they get the benefit of having healthy agaves for their liquor production or their whatever use they're doing. So that's kind of how we've historically worked. And then we've started working more with some small scale private producers who are trying to do more work that supports bats and other, native plants and wildlife. Like I said, working with them to identify wild agaves that they could collect seeds from and grow them in a nursery, create a little nursery on their property, and then plant those and have a restoration program of their own to mitigate their impact from their farm, or letting some flower on their farm. Those are all kind of things that they can do. So we kind of work with them to identify what are some practices that they can do.
Yeah.
And then yeah, the big producers, there's a lot of mitigation work that can happen. We're coming at it as we want to support the bats, and we want to support the local economies and the local communities as much as possible. So how can we do that together? And there are those key practices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there something that I let me reframe. Um, in terms of timeline, what
Mm,
what are the projections? Because agave is a
mm,
slow growing crop. It's a slow growing
yes.
plant. No matter how quickly the fastest growing agave grow, it's still
Yep.
a slow evolution to maturity for each individual plant. What
Hmm.
is the timeline like when working with these local producers or even the
Mm,
big industrial producers? What
mm.
what kind of program are they running over what
Yeah.
duration of time?
Good question. So I think there's two prongs to this. One is what we've talked about so far is kind of the restoration and the replanting aspect.
Right.
That takes time, like a decade, right, at least,
Wow.
to collect the seeds, to grow the agaves in a nursery is a 2 to 3 year process,
Mhm.
usually to get them big enough. Then planting them, that takes another 5 to 10 years for them to flower, right? So you're looking at 10 plus years. So it's a commitment.
Yeah.
But then there's another kind of prong, which I haven't mentioned, which is protection. So
Okay.
there are good, healthy wild agave stands out there, right? There are those good populations. We also want to protect those that are already healthy. They already have varying age classes or ages of agaves that flower every year. Different ones flower.
Mhm.
So if we can protect those, we have this immediate food source happening while we're restoring and replanting. And so, yeah, creating like small exclusion areas from livestock or a reserve where you're making sure you're not going to go harvest those agaves. Those are all other practices you can do to help protect that food source.
Wow.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's I think something that just crossed my mind, the time invested,
Hmm.
the longevity that these programs
Yeah.
need to have in order to be effective. Otherwise,
Hmm.
there's only so much agave to
Yeah.
feed off for the bats, for the next year or two, but
Right.
there needs to be a lot happening for literally decades, which is
Hmm.
pretty crazy to think about.
It is. It's scary, but it's I mean that's the way the natural world often works, right? It's a long process. It's a commitment.
Yeah.
These bats also take a long time to rebound. That's the crazy thing about bats is that they don't have litters of babies every year, and they don't have multiple births every year. Most bat moms give birth to one pup or baby per year. That's
Wow.
it. And so, people think, oh, I'll just get rid of these bats or like reduce them and then they'll rebound like rodents. Mm-mm. They take years and years to rebound that population. So it is a time commitment, but it's very worth it to maintain that relationship.
Yeah.
Hmm.
What is the typical lifespan of some of well, let's just talk about
Hmm.
the agave pollinating bats. What's their typical
Yeah.
lifespan? How much offspring do they have over the course of their life?
Yeah, so I mean, we're looking at 10 plus years of these bats.
Okay.
The oldest known bat in the world, not one of these nectar bats, but an insect eater, it was 41 years old at least in the wild.
Wow.
It was a little insect eating bat that people captured and they banded. Researchers banded it with a unique ID, like a bird band. And
Mhm.
then 41 years later, another group of researchers caught it, and that band was still on there, so they knew that that was the bat.
Wow.
So yeah, these bats are living decades. They're not rodents. They're
Yeah.
not quick and die. So yeah, so they'll have 10, 15, 20 babies in their lifetime, which, one a year, which seems like a lot, but when in the long scheme of things, that's not a lot. So they
Right.
need a lot of time and a lot of help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I want to be sensitive to the time that you have, and I appreciate you being here and having this conversation. Um, so I want to wrap it up with I guess just like one broad question is
Mhm.
what do you think the general public should know about bats, or what is one
Mm.
thing you wish people knew about bats?
Yeah.
Aside from, they're not all blood sucking, they're not,
Yeah.
they're not something to be feared of, they, to be afraid of.
Yeah.
They're not going to turn into vampires. Like what is something you
Hmm.
the average person knew about bats?
Yeah, so that what you just said is definitely like number one is they're just like birds or any other wild animal, right? We don't have to fear them.
Right.
And I think kind of distilling that down is bats need us and we need bats.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there with the pest control services, with the pollination services, the seed dispersal, the medical advances we're learning from bats, all of these things that they are so beneficial to us, to our economies, and to our everyday lives. So we need to protect them, and they are in need of our protection. So, if you're so inclined, please support bat organizations. We many of us are nonprofits. We run off of donations and grants. We're constantly looking for support. So please support bat organizations like Bat Conservation International. Your support goes a long way to protecting bats.
Amazing. Well, I really appreciate you being here and taking the time to talk with me and
Thank you.
expose my audience of tequila lovers to the importance of bats. So thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a lot more we could dive into, so thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks so much.